The syringe trembled in my hand as I watched my father collapse, foam spilling from his lips onto the imported Italian marble of our dining room floor. The poison I'd slipped into his morning coffee was finally taking effect, the same toxin that had killed me in my previous life. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was the familiar ache of betrayal as my stepbrother Marcus rushed to help him, playing the devoted son until the very end. "Call an ambulance!" Marcus shouted, his voice breaking with what sounded like genuine concern. His designer shirt was already stained with coffee and foam as he knelt beside our father's convulsing body. "Dad, stay with me! Sarah, don't just stand there, help me!" If only he knew the truth about whose blood actually ran through his veins. If only he realized that the man he was desperately trying to save wasn't his father at all, but the victim of an 18-year deception orchestrated by the woman he called mother. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, watching this final performance with the detached calm of someone who had already lived through her own death. In my previous life, I died in this very house 3 days from now, poisoned by the same stepmother who'd convinced my father I was worthless, jealous, and undeserving of his love. But death had given me an unexpected gift: rebirth with all my memories intact, return to my 16-year-old body with 2 years to plan the perfect revenge. And this time, I knew exactly how to destroy the family that had destroyed me. The irony was perfect, almost poetic in its justice. Marcus, the golden child who'd stolen my father's love and inheritance, who'd been groomed to take over Morrison Industries while I was pushed aside like an unwanted relic of my father's first marriage. He wasn't even James Morrison's son. He belonged to Richard Blackwood, my father's biggest business rival, the man who'd been trying to destroy our family's empire for over 2 decades, and I was the only one who knew. But unlike my previous life, where I'd died with this secret burning in my chest, this time I'd had the wisdom to gather proof. Incontrovertible, documented, legally certified proof that would not only expose the lie of Marcus's parentage, but destroy every relationship, every alliance, every carefully constructed facade that Elena Hartwell, now Elena Morrison, had built around her deception. The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Soon the paramedics would arrive, followed by the police, followed by questions I was more than prepared to answer. Because unlike my previous life, where I'd been the victim, this time I was the architect of my own justice. The memories of my previous life were as clear as if they'd happened yesterday instead of existing in a timeline that no longer existed. The abuse had started gradually, almost imperceptibly, when I was 7 years old, the day my father married Elena Hartwell. I remembered standing in my mother's garden, wearing a pale blue dress that matched my eyes, watching strangers transform our home for the wedding. Elena had insisted on having the ceremony at the Morrison mansion, claiming it would be more intimate and meaningful than a church service. What she'd really wanted was to establish her dominion over our family home from the very beginning. She'd arrived that morning like a conquering queen, bringing her 5-year-old son Marcus in tow. He was a beautiful child, I had to admit. Cherubic features with dark curls and innocent blue eyes that could melt anyone's heart. My father, James Morrison, had fallen for both of them immediately, desperate as he was to fill the void left by my mother's death 2 years earlier. "Sarah, sweetheart," my father had said, kneeling down to my eye level with Marcus beside him. "I want you to meet your new brother. Marcus is going to be part of our family now, and I want you two to be the best of friends." Even at 7, I'd sensed something was wrong. Marcus hadn't looked at me with the curiosity or excitement of a child meeting a new sister. Instead, his gaze had been calculating, almost possessive, as if he were already sizing up what belonged to him in this grand house. But I'd been desperate for my father's approval, so I'd smiled and offered Marcus my hand. "Hi, Marcus. Do you want to see my dollhouse? It's in the playroom upstairs." "That's very sweet of you, Sarah," Elena had interrupted, her voice honey smooth but her eyes cold as she placed a protective hand on Marcus's shoulder. "But Marcus is tired from the long drive. Perhaps later." That later had never come. Instead, what followed was a systematic campaign to establish Marcus as the favored child while relegating me to the role of an unwelcome guest in my own home. It started with small things. "Sarah needs to learn to share," Elena would whisper to my father whenever I protested Marcus taking my toys, my books, my rightful place at the dinner table. She's being selfish. It's natural for an only child to have difficulty adjusting, but we need to nip this behavior in the bud. My father, desperate to make his new marriage work and guilty about subjecting me to another major life change so soon after my mother's death, had believed Elena's gentle manipulations. Every complaint I made about Marcus was reframed as jealousy. Every attempt to reclaim my possessions was labeled as selfishness. Every expression of confusion or hurt was dismissed as difficulty adjusting to our new family dynamic. By the time I was 10, the transformation was complete. I'd been moved from my spacious bedroom on the second floor, the one with the bay window that overlooked my mother's rose garden, to the smallest room on the third floor, little more than a converted servant's quarters. Marcus, meanwhile, had been given the room that should have been mine, along with the connecting study that my mother had used for her charity work. Marcus needs more space for his projects, Elena had explained when I'd protested the move. He's such a bright boy, always building things and creating. Surely you want your brother to have room to explore his talents. When I was 12, my allowance was cut in half to pay for Marcus's private tutoring. Marcus has shown such exceptional aptitude for mathematics and science, my father had said, barely looking up from his newspaper when he delivered the news. The tutor costs more than we budgeted for, but it's an investment in his future. You understand, don't you, Sarah? When I was 15, my college fund, the one my mother had established before her death, funded by her own inheritance from my grandmother, mysteriously disappeared, transferred to an account designated for Marcus's future Stanford education. I'd only discovered this by accident, overhearing Elena on the phone with the bank. "Yes, I'm calling about the Morrison Education Fund," she'd said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "The one under Sarah Morrison's name?" "Yes, I need to transfer the entire balance to the Marcus Morrison account. I have power of attorney." "Yes, the transfer should be immediate." I'd confronted my father that same day, bursting into his study with bank statements and account numbers, desperate to make him understand what Elena had done. But he'd barely listened, dismissing my concerns with the practiced ease of a man who'd grown tired of what he saw as his daughter's constant complaints. "Marcus has so much potential," he'd said, not even looking up from the contracts he was reviewing. "We have to invest in his future. The boy could revolutionize the pharmaceutical industry with his mind. You'll understand when you're older, Sarah. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good of the family." But I'd understood perfectly even then. In my father's eyes, Marcus was the son he'd always wanted. Charming, athletic, academically gifted. Everything a Morrison heir should be. I was just the disappointing daughter from his first marriage, a burden left behind by my deceased mother, a reminder of a love that belonged to the past. The favoritism wasn't subtle. At family dinners, my father would hang on Marcus's every word, praising his insights about business and politics with the pride of a man grooming his successor. When Marcus expressed interest in joining the company, my father immediately arranged internships and mentorship opportunities. When I'd made the same request, I'd been told I should focus on more suitable pursuits like art or literature. "Business is complicated, sweetheart," my father had said, his tone patronizing in a way that made my skin crawl. "It requires a certain kind of analytical mind. Perhaps you'd be happier pursuing something more creative." The final blow had come on my 18th birthday. Instead of the celebration I'd hoped for, some acknowledgement that I was now an adult, ready to take my place in the family business, my father had used the occasion to make an announcement that shattered what little hope I'd been clinging to. We'd been having dinner in the formal dining room, the same room where I'd watched him collapse in this new timeline. Ileana had insisted on using my mother's best china for the occasion, claiming it was more appropriate for such an important milestone. The irony hadn't been lost on me, even then. "Sarah," my father had said, raising his wine glass as if proposing a toast, "now that you're 18, it's time we discussed your future." I'd felt a flutter of hope in my chest. Finally, I'd thought. Finally, he's going to acknowledge that I'm old enough to contribute to Morrison Industries. "As you know," he'd continued, "I've been grooming Marcus to take over the company when I retire. The board has already approved him as my heir apparent." The words had hit me like a physical blow. Marcus, who was only 16 at the time, had already been officially designated as the future head of Morrison Industries. The company my grandfather had built, the legacy that should have been mine as the biological heir, was being handed to my stepbrother before he'd even graduated high school. But don't worry, my father had added, as if his words were meant to be comforting. You'll be well taken care of. There's a trust fund, not large, but sufficient for you to live comfortably. Perhaps you could travel or pursue that art degree you mentioned. The world is full of possibilities for a young woman with your interests. Elena had reached across the table to pat my hand, her touch making my skin crawl. It's for the best, dear, she'd said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Business is such a man's world, so competitive and ruthless. You wouldn't want that kind of pressure, would you? Much better to let Marcus handle those difficult decisions while you focus on creating a beautiful life for yourself. I'd excused myself from dinner that night and locked myself in my small room on the third floor, finally understanding that I would never be anything more than an afterthought in my father's house. No matter what I accomplished, no matter how hard I worked to prove myself worthy, I would always be second to Marcus in my father's eyes. That's when I'd started digging into the family finances, desperate to find some piece of leverage that might change my father's mind. I'd learned to hack into email accounts and bank records, driven by the kind of desperate resourcefulness that comes from having nothing left to lose. And that's when I'd discovered the truth that would have saved me if only I'd been smart enough to handle it properly. I'd found the hotel records first, receipts from the Grandview Hotel dating back to Elena's supposed business trips before she'd married my father. Then came the romantic text messages on an old phone she'd thought she'd destroyed. Finally, I'd discovered the love letter that had been hidden in a safety deposit box. A passionate note from Richard Blackwood where he'd called Marcus our little secret and promised Elena that their son would inherit everything that belongs to our enemies. The timeline was damning. Elena's affair with Richard Blackwood had begun during the pharmaceutical industry conference, where she'd supposedly met my father. 9 months before Marcus was born, she'd been sharing a hotel room with Richard while publicly courting James Morrison. She'd played them both, ultimately choosing my father because his wealth was more immediately accessible than Richard's, but maintaining her relationship with Richard throughout her marriage. I'd been so naive in my previous life, so desperate for my father's love and approval, that I'd approached him directly with the evidence. I'd burst into his study one evening, armed with printouts and bank records, convinced that the truth would finally open his eyes to Elena's deception. "Dad, you have to listen to me," I'd said, spreading the documents across his desk. "I know why Elena really married you. I know who Marcus's real father is." But my father had refused to even look at the evidence. His face had darkened with anger, and he'd swept the papers onto the floor without reading them. "Enough," he'd said, his voice cold with disappointment. "I'm tired of this, Sarah. I'm tired of your jealousy, your constant attempts to undermine Elena and Marcus. They're my family now, and you need to accept that." "But Dad, the dates—" "You're just jealous," he'd interrupted, standing up from his desk with the kind of finality that brooked no argument. "Elena loves me, and Marcus is my son. I won't listen to these lies anymore. If you can't accept your stepmother and brother, then perhaps it's time you considered living elsewhere." I'd tried once more, desperately pulling out the love letter from Richard. "Just read this. Please, just look at what Richard wrote about Marcus." My father had snatched the letter from my hands and thrown it into the fireplace without reading it. I said, "Enough. Elena is my wife. Marcus is my son, and you need to stop this behavior before you destroy what's left of our relationship." That had been 3 days before Elena's invitation to tea. 3 days before my death. "Just the two of us," she'd said, her voice warm and motherly over the phone. "I think it's time we talked, woman to woman. Perhaps we can find a way to put this unpleasantness behind us. I know you're hurting, Sarah, and I want to help." I'd been so desperate for acceptance, so worn down by years of being treated as an outsider in my own home, that I'd believed her. I'd actually thought Elena wanted to make peace, to finally treat me like the daughter she'd never had. The tea service had been set up in the sunroom, Elena's favorite spot in the house with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured gardens. She'd used my mother's finest china, a passive-aggressive choice that I'd been too naive to recognize at the time. "I've been thinking about what you said to your father," Elena had begun, pouring the Earl Grey with practiced elegance. "About Richard and Marcus. I know it must be difficult for you feeling like an outsider." "I just want Dad to see the truth," I'd said, accepting the delicate cup with hands that trembled slightly from nerves. "I'm not making this up, Elena. I have proof." "I know you do." Her admission had stopped me cold. "You're quite resourceful, Sarah. I've always admired that about you." The poison had been tasteless in the bergamot-scented tea. I'd realized what was happening only when my vision began to blur, when my hands started shaking so violently I could no longer hold the cup. "Why?" I'd whispered, my voice already slurring as the toxins spread through my system. Elena had set down her own cup, untouched, I'd realized too late, and smiled with the cold satisfaction of a predator who'd finally cornered her prey. "Because you know too much," she'd said simply. "And because James will never believe you over me. By tomorrow, this will all look like a tragic suicide. A troubled young woman, overwhelmed by jealousy and family drama, who took her own life rather than face the consequences of her delusions." I'd tried to stand, tried to run, but my legs had already given out. Elena had watched me collapse onto the Italian marble floor with the detached interest of someone observing a mildly entertaining performance. "The note's already written," she'd continued conversationally. "In your handwriting, of course. You apologize for the lies you told about Marcus, for the pain you caused the family. You explain that you can't live with the guilt anymore." My last coherent thought before the darkness claimed me had been a desperate wish that my father would somehow realize the truth. That he would investigate my death, discover Elena's deception, and finally understand that I'd been trying to protect him all along. But death hadn't been the end. Somehow, whether by cosmic justice, divine intervention, or simple impossible luck, I'd woken up in my 16-year-old body 2 years before my murder, with every memory of my previous life intact, and this time I wouldn't be naive enough to trust anyone with the truth until I'd gathered enough evidence to make denial impossible. The rebirth had been disorienting at first. I'd awakened in my childhood bedroom on what I recognized as my 16th birthday, my mind sharp with memories that shouldn't have existed yet while my body was 2 years younger than it should have been. The calendar on my desk had confirmed my suspicions. I was back in time, given a second chance that I intended to use wisely. But this time, I wouldn't confront them directly. This time, I'd be smart about it. My first stop had been Richard Blackwood's medical office. As the head of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, Richard maintained a private laboratory in his office building where he conducted research into genetic therapies. Breaking in should have been impossible for a 16-year-old girl, but being the daughter of his business rival had taught me plenty about his security systems from my father's failed industrial espionage attempts. The building was a monument to modern architecture, all glass and steel rising 30 floors above the city skyline. Richard's private laboratory occupied the entire 28th floor, accessible only by a special elevator that required both a key card and biometric identification. But I'd learned from overhearing my father's frustrated phone calls that the emergency stairwell had a maintenance access point that bypassed the main security system. I'd spent weeks planning my infiltration, studying the building's layout from publicly available architectural plans and noting the patterns of the security guards' rounds. The night I'd chosen had been perfect. A Friday evening when most of the building would be empty, during a thunderstorm that would mask any sound I might make. Getting to the 28th floor had been the easy part. The maintenance tunnels were cramped and dusty, but they led directly to the laboratory's ventilation system. I'd worn all black, including gloves and a face mask, knowing that DNA evidence could be my downfall if I was caught. Richard's private laboratory was a temple to scientific vanity. Gleaming equipment filled the space, most of it bearing his company's logo. Awards and certificates covered the walls, documenting his rise from ambitious researcher to pharmaceutical mogul, but what I'd needed was much simpler than his high-tech machinery. I'd found his personal office adjoining the main lab, a space that was more like a luxury apartment than a workplace. Persian rugs covered polished marble floors, and original artwork adorned the walls. His massive mahogany desk held family photos, including several of Marcus that made my stomach turn. The DNA samples I needed were easier to collect than I'd expected. Richard's hairbrush sat on a small vanity table near his private bathroom, still containing several dark strands that were clearly fresh. His personal coffee mug, emblazoned with "World's Greatest Dad" in Marcus's childish handwriting, provided excellent opportunities for saliva collection. But the real treasure was in his private laboratory refrigerator, where he stored tissue samples from his own genetic research. I'd taken several vials of his blood and tissue, carefully replacing them with samples I'd prepared using pig's blood and gelatin. If anyone noticed the substitution, they'd assume the samples had degraded due to improper storage. Getting out had been more nerve-wracking than getting in. A security guard had been making his rounds earlier than expected, forcing me to hide in a supply closet for nearly an hour while he completed his patrol. But eventually, I'd made it back to the maintenance tunnels and out of the building without being detected. The next challenge had been obtaining Marcus's DNA without arousing suspicion. This had required a more delicate approach, since I couldn't simply break into his room and steal hair from his brush without Elena noticing. I'd chosen to visit our family's longtime barber, Giuseppe Torino, who'd been cutting Morrison men's hair for 3 generations. Giuseppe's shop was a throwback to an earlier era, with leather chairs and vintage equipment that made every haircut feel like a ritual. "Signorina Sara!" Giuseppe had exclaimed when I'd entered his shop on a Saturday afternoon. "What brings you here? You want the Giuseppe special treatment for your beautiful hair?" "Actually, Giuseppe, I was hoping you could help me with a project," I'd said, putting on my most innocent smile. "I'm making a scrapbook for Marcus's birthday, and I thought it would be sweet to include a lock of his hair from when he was younger. Do you still have any clippings from his previous visits?" Giuseppe's face had lit up with delight. "Ah, see, such a devoted sister you are. I keep everything for my special families. Let me check my collection." He'd disappeared into the back room and returned with a small envelope labeled with Marcus's name and the date of his last haircut. "Here, take what you need. Such a good sister, making memories for the family." I'd thanked Giuseppe profusely and left with enough of Marcus's hair to conduct multiple DNA tests. The old barber's sentimentality had made my task almost embarrassingly easy. The private DNA testing facility I'd chosen was 3 cities away, far from anyone who might recognize the Morrison name. GeneTech Laboratories advertised complete discretion and rapid results, accepting payment in cash with no questions asked. I'd used a fake name and address, claiming to be adopted and searching for my biological parents. 2 weeks later, the results had arrived via the anonymous email account I'd set up. Marcus Hartwell was 99.97% likely to be the biological son of Richard Blackwood, with a 0% probability of being related to James Morrison. But I hadn't stopped there. I'd ordered confirmatory tests from 3 different laboratories, each using different methodologies to ensure the results couldn't be disputed. I'd also paid extra for chain of custody documentation that would hold up in court, bribing a lab technician to keep detailed records of every step in the testing process. When the time came to reveal the truth, I'd wanted ironclad proof that couldn't be dismissed as fabricated or contaminated. Phase 2 of my plan had required more patience and significantly more technical skill. I'd needed to document Elena's ongoing affair with Richard, gathering evidence that would prove the deception wasn't just a mistake from the past, but an active conspiracy that had continued throughout her marriage to my father. This had meant surveillance work that pushed the boundaries of what I could accomplish as a teenage girl. I'd started by installing tracking software on Elena's phone, using a technique I'd learned from online tutorials about digital forensics. The software was nearly undetectable and transmitted her location data to an encrypted server I'd set up using a false identity. The tracking data had revealed patterns that confirmed my suspicions. Elena met with Richard Blackwood at least twice a month, always at the Grandview Hotel on the outskirts of town. Their meetings followed a consistent schedule, 2nd and 4th Tuesdays, always in the afternoon, always lasting exactly 2 hours. I'd begun photographing these meetings using a telephoto lens I'd borrowed from my school's photography club. The Grandview Hotel was perfect for surveillance, an older building with multiple vantage points that allowed me to document Elena and Richard's arrivals and departures without being seen. The photos I'd collected were damning. Elena and Richard kissing in the hotel parking lot. Richard's hand on Elena's lower back as he guided her into the building. The 2 of them sharing intimate conversations over wine in the hotel's restaurant. Each image was time-stamped and geotagged, creating an irrefutable record of their ongoing relationship. But I'd needed more than just photographic evidence. I'd needed them to confess their deception in their own words. Installing listening devices in Elena's car had been more challenging than the phone tracking. I'd waited until she'd taken the vehicle in for routine maintenance, then paid the mechanic's assistant to plant a small recording device under the passenger seat. The device was voice activated and could record up to 40 hours of conversation before needing to download its contents. The conversations I'd captured were even more damning than I'd hoped. Elena and Richard discussing their son's future inheritance. Elena bragging about how easy it had been to manipulate my father. Richard expressing his satisfaction at watching his biological son grow up with access to Morrison Industries' secrets. But the most devastating recording had come from a meeting in March, 3 months before Marcus's 18th birthday. Elena and Richard had been discussing their long-term strategy, and Elena's words had made it clear that my murder in the previous timeline hadn't been a spontaneous decision. "Sarah's getting too suspicious," Elena had said, her voice carrying clearly through the hidden microphone. "She's been asking questions about the trust fund transfer, and yesterday I caught her looking through my personal papers." "What do you want to do about it?" Richard had replied. "I think it's time to consider more permanent solutions," Elena had said, her tone casual, as if she were discussing weekend plans. "James will never suspect anything if it looks like suicide. A troubled teenager, overwhelmed by jealousy and family drama. It happens all the time." The recording had made me physically sick, but it had also confirmed that I'd been right to plan my revenge so carefully. Elena wasn't just a gold digger or an unfaithful wife. She was a calculating predator who would kill to protect her secrets. I'd made copies of every piece of evidence, storing them in multiple locations, both physical and digital. Safety deposit boxes in 3 different banks. Encrypted cloud storage accounts accessible only through anonymous networks. Physical copies hidden in places Elena would never think to look. When the time came for my revenge, I'd wanted to be absolutely certain that my evidence couldn't be destroyed or suppressed. The final piece of my preparation had been the most emotionally difficult, deciding exactly how to destroy Elena and Richard's lives in the most public and humiliating way possible. I'd considered multiple scenarios, but ultimately I'd realized that Marcus's 18th birthday party would provide the perfect opportunity. In my previous life, that party had been my father's announcement of Marcus as his heir. This time, I'd make sure it became Elena and Marcus's public downfall instead. The guest list for the party had included everyone who mattered in our social circle: business leaders, politicians, journalists, and socialites. My father had spared no expense, wanting to showcase his son to the people who would shape Marcus's future in the business world. I'd spent weeks preparing my presentation, organizing the evidence into a compelling narrative that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. DNA test results from multiple laboratories, photographs documenting Elena's affair, audio recordings of her confession, financial records showing the systematic theft of Morrison family assets. But most importantly, I'd prepared for Elena's inevitable counterattack. She would claim the evidence was fabricated, that I was mentally unstable, that my accusations were motivated by jealousy. I'd needed to be ready for every possible defense she might mount. 3 days before the party, I'd sent anonymous copies of all my evidence to investigative journalists at 3 major newspapers. Not enough information to break the story early, but sufficient to ensure that reporters would be prepared to follow up immediately after my public revelation. I'd also arranged for law enforcement to receive copies of the evidence documenting Elena's financial crimes. Wire fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement were federal offenses that would result in serious prison time if prosecuted successfully. Everything had been in place. All that remained was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Morrison mansion had been transformed into something from a fairy tale for Marcus's 18th birthday celebration. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across the polished marble floors, while thousands of white roses and golden ribbons turned the main ballroom into a palace worthy of royalty. The caterers had outdone themselves, offering delicacies that most of the guests had never tasted, despite their considerable wealth. I'd watched the preparations with the detached fascination of someone observing her own execution. Elena had spared no expense in creating the perfect stage for what she'd believed would be Marcus's coronation as the Morrison heir. Instead, she'd unknowingly created the ideal setting for her own destruction, The guest list read like a who's who of the city's power elite. Mayor Richardson and his wife had arrived fashionably late, followed by Senator Bradford and the entire board of directors from Morrison Industries. Journalists from the business section of every major newspaper mingled with pharmaceutical executives and real estate moguls. Even Judge Hamilton, who would likely preside over Elena's eventual criminal trial, was present with his family. I'd dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a simple black cocktail dress that wouldn't draw attention away from the evidence I'd be presenting. My hair was pulled back in a classic chignon, and I'd worn my mother's pearl necklace, the one piece of her jewelry that Elena hadn't managed to appropriate for herself. Elena herself had been radiant in a silver gown that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. The dress was custom designed to showcase the figure she'd maintained through expensive personal trainers and cosmetic procedures funded by my father's money. Diamond earrings caught the light whenever she moved, and her smile was brilliant enough to power the mansion's chandeliers. Marcus had looked every inch the golden child in his custom tuxedo, accepting congratulations from guests who believed they were witnessing the birth of a business dynasty. His thick, dark hair was perfectly styled, and his blue eyes sparkled with excitement as he held court near the massive fireplace in the main ballroom. "You must be so proud," I'd overheard Mrs. Bradford saying to Elena as they stood near the champagne fountain. "Marcus is such a handsome young man and so intelligent. He'll make a wonderful successor to your husband." "Oh, I am," Elena had replied, her voice warm with maternal pride that made my stomach turn. "James and I have worked so hard to give Marcus every opportunity. Tonight feels like the culmination of all our dreams." The irony had been almost too much to bear. Elena was celebrating the success of an 18-year deception, basking in praise for raising another man's child to inherit my family's legacy. But her triumph would be short-lived. As the evening progressed, I'd positioned myself strategically near the main presentation screen that had been set up to display family photos throughout the celebration. My father's assistant had given me the access codes earlier, believing I wanted to add some surprise photos to honor Marcus's special day. The moment had arrived just after my father's toast to the assembled guests. He'd stood at the center of the ballroom, champagne glass raised, commanding the attention of everyone present with the natural authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Ladies and gentlemen," my father had announced, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet room, "I want to thank you all for celebrating this special day with my family. As you know, tonight marks not just Marcus's 18th birthday, but also an important transition for Morrison Industries." The crowd had quieted further, everyone eager to hear the official announcement that had been anticipated for months. Elena had moved to stand beside my father, her arm linked through his, as if she'd already won the ultimate prize. Marcus had stepped forward as well, his face glowing with pride and excitement. "It gives me great pleasure to announce that Marcus will be joining the company immediately as heir apparent, with plans to assume the role of CEO within the next 5 years," my father had continued. "I can think of no one better suited to carry on the Morrison family legacy." The applause had been thunderous. Marcus had stepped forward to shake hands with board members and accept congratulations from family friends. Elena had basked in the reflected glory, accepting praise for her role in raising such an exceptional young man. That's when I'd stood up. "Before we celebrate," I'd said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet ballroom, "I think there's something everyone should know about the Morrison family heir." The silence that followed had been immediate and complete. Every conversation had stopped, every glass had been lowered, every eye had turned toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to alarm. My father's face had darkened with embarrassment and anger. "Sarah, this isn't the time or place." "Actually, Dad, this is the perfect time and place," I'd replied, walking toward the presentation screen with the tablet I'd prepared. "Because I have some very interesting information about Marcus's true parentage that I think our guests deserve to hear." Elena had gone pale beneath her expertly applied makeup, but she'd tried to maintain her composure. "Sarah, you're being dramatic and inappropriate. This is neither the time nor the place for whatever attention-seeking behavior you have planned." "Oh, but it is," I'd said, connecting my tablet to the presentation system with the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed this moment countless times. "You see, I've been doing some research into our family history over the past 2 years, and I've discovered something absolutely fascinating about the Morrison family tree." The screen had flickered to life, displaying the first slide of my presentation. The Morrison family crest appeared, followed by a genealogical chart showing 3 generations of family lineage. But the final entry, Marcus's name, was highlighted in red with a large question mark beside it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd announced to the captivated audience, I present to you the results of comprehensive DNA testing conducted by 3 independent laboratories. The next slide had filled the screen with the paternity test results, blown up large enough for everyone in the ballroom to read clearly. A collective gasp had gone through the crowd as they'd processed what they were seeing. According to multiple independent DNA analyses, I'd continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Marcus Hartwell is not the biological son of James Morrison. He is, however, a 99.97% genetic match for Richard Blackwood, my father's biggest business rival and the head of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals. The reaction had been immediate and explosive. Guests had begun whispering frantically to each other, their voices creating a buzzing undertone that filled the ballroom. Several people had pulled out their phones, probably already texting the news to contacts who weren't present. Richard Blackwood, who had been standing near the back of the crowd with his own family, had tried to slip toward the exit, but all eyes had already turned toward him. His face had gone white as a sheet, and his wife had stared at him with dawning horror as the implications became clear. Marcus had stood frozen in the center of the room, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and dawning horror as he'd processed what I was saying. The confident young man who had been accepting congratulations moments earlier had suddenly looked very much like the frightened child he'd once been. "Sarah!" Elena had shrieked, her composure finally cracking. "This is outrageous. These tests could be fabricated, manipulated, taken out of context." Which is why I had the testing done by 3 different laboratories using 3 different methodologies. I'd replied smoothly, advancing to the next slide. Gene tech, bioanalytics, and precision genomics all reached the same conclusion. The probability of error is less than 0.03%. The new slide had shown the letterheads and certifications from all 3 laboratories, along with chain of custody documentation that proved the samples had been handled properly. I'd even included photos of myself collecting the DNA evidence, time-stamped and geotagged to prevent any claims of fabrication. But wait, I'd continued, channeling the dramatic flair of a television prosecutor. There's more. The next series of slides had documented Elena's affair with Richard Blackwood, starting with hotel receipts from before her marriage to my father, and continuing through recent photographs I'd taken during their secret meetings. The timestamps had created an undeniable timeline stretching back nearly 20 years. As you can see from these hotel records, I'd explained, pointing to specific entries highlighted on the screen, Elena Morrison and Richard Blackwood have been conducting an affair since before her marriage to my father. These photographs were taken over the past 6 months, but the relationship has clearly been ongoing since Marcus's conception. The evidence had been overwhelming. Photos of Elena and Richard kissing in restaurant booths. Images of them entering and leaving the Grandview Hotel together. Credit card receipts showing Richard paying for romantic dinners and expensive gifts. A paper trail that documented a 2-decade deception with meticulous detail. My father had stood paralyzed, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand as he'd stared at the screen displaying proof of his wife's betrayal. His face had cycled through disbelief, rage, and devastating hurt as the full scope of Elena's deception had become clear. Elena had looked like a cornered animal, her eyes darting between the exits as if calculating her chances of escape. But there had been nowhere to run. Every door was blocked by guests who were recording her humiliation on their phones. These photos could be doctored, she'd tried desperately. Digital manipulation is so sophisticated these days. Which is why I also have audio recordings, I'd announced, clicking to the next slide. The ballroom's sound system had filled with Elena's voice, crystal clear and unmistakably her own. James sees what he wants to see. He's so desperate for a male heir that he'd never question Marcus's paternity. It's pathetic, really. I've been bleeding him dry for 18 years, and he's so grateful to have a son that he'd give Marcus anything. The silence that had followed the recording had been deafening. Even the whispered conversations had stopped as everyone in the room had processed Elena's casual confession to 18 years of systematic deception and financial fraud. But I hadn't been finished. The next recording had been even more damning. Elena discussing her plans for my murder with the same casual tone she might have used to plan a dinner party. Sarah's getting too suspicious, Elena's voice had continued from the speakers. I think it's time to consider more permanent solutions. James will never suspect anything if it looks like suicide. A troubled teenager, overwhelmed by jealousy and family drama. The reaction had been immediate and visceral. Several guests had gasped audibly, and I'd seen more than one person reach for their phones to call the police. Elena's confession to premeditated murder had transformed what might have been seen as a family scandal into something much more serious. You vindictive little bitch, Elena had finally snarled, dropping all pretense of maternal affection or social grace. You've always been jealous of Marcus, of me, of everything we've built here. This is nothing but a pathetic attempt to destroy what you could never have. What I could never have? I'd repeated, my voice calm despite the rage burning in my chest. You mean my father's love? My rightful inheritance? The family legacy that was stolen from me to give to another man's son? I'd pulled out the thick folder I'd prepared and walked directly to my father, placing it in his trembling hands. These are copies of all the financial records showing how Elena systematically embezzled money from Morrison Industries over the past 18 years. Every forged signature, every unauthorized transfer, every fraudulent transaction. She's stolen approximately $47 million from our family. The number had hit the crowd like a physical blow. $47 million was more than many of the guests were worth, despite their considerable wealth. The scope of Elena's theft had transformed her from an unfaithful wife into a major criminal. The money trail is all documented, I'd continued, addressing my father directly while the room watched in stunned silence. Bank records, wire transfer receipts, offshore account statements. She's been funding Richard Blackwood's company with our family's money while raising his son to inherit everything our grandfather built. The implications had been staggering, and I'd watched the realization dawn on the faces of everyone present. Not only had Elena betrayed her marriage and committed massive fraud, but she'd also potentially orchestrated the perfect corporate espionage operation. Richard Blackwood's biological son, raised with access to all of Morrison Industries' secrets, had been positioned to inherit the company that Richard had been trying to destroy for decades. Several of my father's business associates had begun backing away from the family, probably calculating how this scandal would affect their own relationships with Morrison Industries. The photographers present, both professional and amateur, had been having a field day capturing every moment of Elena's humiliation for posterity. Marcus had suddenly found his voice, his words barely audible over the whispered conversations filling the ballroom. Sarah, please, I didn't know. I swear I had no idea about any of this. Of course you didn't, I'd replied, and for the first time that evening, my voice had softened with genuine pity. You were just a child when this deception started, Marcus. But you're 18 now, old enough to understand that every privilege you've enjoyed, every opportunity you've been given, was bought with stolen money and built on lies. My father had finally found his voice, though it had come out as barely more than a whisper. Elena, is this true? Elena had made one last desperate attempt to maintain control, her voice rising to near hysteria. James, you can't believe this. Sarah has clearly had some kind of breakdown. She's always been unstable, jealous, manipulative. Security, my father had interrupted, his voice hollow and broken. Please escort Elena and Marcus off the property immediately. They are no longer welcome in my home. The security team had stepped forward, but Elena hadn't finished her performance. You'll regret this, she'd screamed as they'd approached her. Sarah is a monster. She's been planning this for years. She'll destroy you all if you let her. As the security guards had taken her arms, Elena had made one final desperate play. James, I love you. Whatever mistakes I've made, I love you. Don't let Sarah poison your mind against me. But my father had turned away, unable or unwilling to look at the woman who had deceived him for 18 years. Get her out of my sight, he'd said quietly. Get them both out. The security team had escorted Elena and Marcus toward the exit, but Elena's voice had carried clearly back to the ballroom as she'd made her final threat. This isn't over. I'll fight this in court. I'll destroy the Morrison name before I let Sarah have what she wants. The doors had closed behind them, cutting off her protests and leaving the ballroom in stunned silence. 300 of the city's most influential people had just witnessed the complete destruction of what they'd believed to be a loving family, and no one had seemed quite sure how to react. My father had stood at the center of it all, still holding the folder of evidence I'd given him, looking older and more broken than I'd ever seen him. When he'd finally looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in years, his eyes had been filled with a pain so deep it had almost made me regret my revenge. "How long have you known?" he'd asked, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. "About the affair? About Marcus's real parentage? About the embezzlement?" I'd shrugged, trying to appear casual despite the emotional hurricane raging inside me. "Long enough to gather evidence. I tried to tell you before, Dad, but you wouldn't listen. You said I was just jealous." The pain in his eyes had deepened, and I'd seen the exact moment when he'd realized the full scope of his failure as a father. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry. I failed you completely. I failed your mother's memory. I let them convince me that you were the problem when you were trying to protect me all along." "Yes," I'd said simply, "you did." It hadn't been forgiveness, not yet, but it had been acknowledgement, which was more than I'd ever received in my previous life. The party had dissolved after that, guests making hurried excuses and departing with their phones already buzzing with calls to lawyers, reporters, and business associates. By morning, the Morrison family scandal would be the lead story in every newspaper and the top trend on every social media platform. But I hadn't been finished with my revenge. The public humiliation had been satisfying, but it was only the beginning of Elena and Richard's punishment. 6 months later, I'd sat in the marble-appointed conference room of Morrison Industries, reviewing quarterly profit reports that showed the company's most successful period in its 70-year history. The scandal that had destroyed Elena and Marcus had also purged Morrison Industries of the financial parasites that had been bleeding it dry for nearly 2 decades. Without Elena's systematic embezzlement, the company's cash flow had improved dramatically. The recovery of stolen funds, facilitated by federal prosecutors who'd been eager to make an example of such a high-profile case, had provided additional capital for expansion into new markets. But the most satisfying change had been personal rather than financial. My father had begun treating me as a true partner in the business, seeking my input on major decisions and respecting my insights in a way he'd never done when Marcus had been his presumed heir. The pharmaceutical division's numbers are particularly impressive, I'd noted, reviewing the latest reports. Acquiring Blackwood's research portfolio at the bankruptcy auction was brilliant strategy. My father had smiled, a real smile, the first I'd seen from him since the night of Marcus's birthday party. "That was your idea, Sarah. I never would have thought to turn Richard's downfall into our opportunity." The irony had been perfect. Richard Blackwood's company had imploded completely when the scandal broke, losing government contracts and private investors alike. When Blackwood Pharmaceuticals had been forced into bankruptcy, Morrison Industries had acquired their most valuable research projects for a fraction of their worth. Richard himself was serving a 12-year federal sentence for corporate espionage, fraud, and conspiracy. The prosecution had argued successfully that his relationship with Elena constituted a complex criminal enterprise designed to infiltrate and ultimately destroy Morrison Industries from within. Elena's fate had been even more satisfying. In addition to 7 years in federal prison for embezzlement and wire fraud, she'd been ordered to pay back every penny she'd stolen, plus interest and penalties that had left her completely destitute. Her assets had been seized to compensate the Morrison family, and she'd lost even her jewelry and designer clothing in the asset forfeiture process. The murder conspiracy charges had been more difficult to prosecute, since I'd been unable to prove that Elena had actually poisoned me in the timeline that no longer existed. But the recorded confession of her intent to commit murder had been sufficient to enhance her other sentences and ensure she'd serve the maximum possible time. Marcus had been the most tragic casualty of the whole affair. Learning that his entire life had been built on lies had shattered something fundamental in him. He'd withdrawn from Stanford, lost most of his friends when the story had become public, and had struggled with severe depression as he'd tried to rebuild his identity from scratch. I'd actually felt sorry for him, which had surprised me. Despite everything, Marcus had been a victim too, manipulated and used by Elena just as I had been, though in a very different way. He'd reached out to me once, about 3 months after the scandal broke. wanting to apologize and somehow make amends. "I know I can't undo the damage," he'd said during our brief, awkward meeting at a neutral coffee shop. "I know I took things that should have been yours, but I want you to know that I never asked for any of it. I thought James was really my father. I thought I belonged in your family." "I know," I'd replied, and I'd meant it. "Elena lied to you too, Marcus. She used you just like she used all of us." He'd been living with Richard's sister in Oregon, working as a construction laborer while trying to finish his high school diploma through correspondence courses. The life of privilege he'd known was gone forever, but he'd seemed to be finding some peace in honest work and simple living. I'd occasionally wondered if I should have tried to help him somehow, but I'd decided that he needed to find his own way in the world. The Morrison inheritance had never been rightfully his, and returning it to me had been justice, not cruelty. The best part of my revenge, though, had been watching my father transform from the broken man who'd been manipulated for 18 years into someone who truly saw and valued me. We'd begun having dinner together every Sunday, just the two of us, talking about business and family and the future I would inherit. "I've been thinking about the foundation you proposed," he'd said during one of our recent dinners. "The scholarship program for young women in business. I'd like to fund it personally, not through the company." I'd looked up from my salmon, surprised by the emotion in his voice. "That's very generous, Dad. But why personally rather than through Morrison Industries?" "Because this is about atonement," he'd said quietly. "About trying to make up for the years I failed you. Every scholarship we award, every young woman we help, it's my way of honoring what should have been done for you from the beginning." The Morrison Foundation for Women in Business had launched 2 months later with an initial endowment of $20 million. We'd already awarded our first round of scholarships to 30 young women who'd been overlooked or underestimated by their families, and the response had been overwhelming. But even more satisfying than the foundation had been the daily proof that I'd finally reclaimed my rightful place in my father's life. My office was now on the executive floor, next to his, with Sarah Morrison, Vice President of Strategic Development, etched on a brass nameplate. The company letterhead listed me as second in command, and industry publications had begun referring to me as James Morrison's heir apparent. Elena had tried to appeal her conviction, of course. Her lawyers had argued that the DNA evidence was inadmissible, that the recordings were obtained illegally, that her confession had been taken out of context, but the federal prosecutors had built an airtight case and every appeal had been denied. I'd received letters from her in prison, angry, rambling screeds that blamed me for destroying her life and Marcus's future. The letters had grown increasingly unhinged over time, filled with threats and delusions that had eventually prompted the prison authorities to restrict her mail privileges. "You think you've won," her last letter had read, "but you'll never be happy. You'll never be satisfied. You destroyed an innocent boy's life for your own selfish revenge, and that guilt will eat you alive. James will realize what kind of monster you really are, and then you'll be alone again, just like you've always been alone." I'd thrown that letter away without finishing it, but her words had bothered me more than I'd cared to admit. Had my revenge been justified, or had I become the monster Elena claimed I was? The answer had come during a board meeting 6 months after Elena's conviction, when one of the older directors had made a casual comment that had put everything in perspective. "It's remarkable how much stronger the company has become since we cleared out the corruption," Harold Wickham had said, reviewing our latest financial projections. "Sarah, your father should be proud. You've helped him build something that will last for generations." That's when I'd realized the truth. My revenge hadn't been about destroying Elena and Marcus. It had been about saving my father and preserving my family's legacy. Elena's plan would have ultimately succeeded if I'd never been reborn. Marcus would have inherited Morrison Industries, Richard would have gained access to all our trade secrets, and my father would have been left with nothing when the deception was finally revealed. By exposing the truth when I did, I'd prevented a much greater catastrophe. Morrison Industries was now stronger than ever, my father had been freed from an 18-year manipulation, and the real criminals were paying for their crimes. The only regret I'd had was that my mother couldn't see how everything had turned out. She'd died, believing that my father would protect our family's legacy and ensure that her daughter had a place in the world she'd helped create. Elena had nearly destroyed that dream, but in the end, my mother's faith had been justified. I'd begun visiting my mother's grave every month, bringing fresh flowers and updates about the company's progress. The headstone was simple white marble with her name, dates, and a quote she'd loved. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." "I think you'd be proud of how things turned out," I'd told her during my most recent visit. "It took longer than we hoped, but justice won in the end. The Morrison legacy is secure, and I'm finally the daughter you raised me to be." The wind had rustled through the oak trees that surrounded the cemetery, and for a moment I'd felt her presence so strongly it had taken my breath away. My mother had always believed that truth and justice would ultimately prevail, even when circumstances made that seem impossible. She'd been right, as she'd been about so many things. 2 years after Elena's conviction, Morrison Industries had not only recovered from the scandal, but had become more successful than ever before. Our stock price had reached record highs. We'd expanded into 3 new international markets, and industry analysts were calling us the most innovative pharmaceutical company in North America. My role had expanded along with the company's success. At 20 years old, I was the youngest vice president in Morrison Industries history, and business publications had begun featuring me on their covers as one of the rising stars of American business. But the most meaningful recognition had come from my father during our annual shareholders meeting, when he'd announced his succession plan to a room full of investors and industry leaders. "Ladies and gentlemen," he'd said, standing at the podium with the confidence of a man who'd rebuilt his life from the ashes of betrayal, "I'm pleased to announce that, effective immediately, Sarah Morrison will be assuming the role of President and Chief Operating Officer of Morrison Industries. She will succeed me as CEO when I retire in 5 years." The applause had been thunderous, and I'd seen genuine respect in the eyes of board members who'd once dismissed me as just Morrison's daughter. The little girl who'd been overlooked and underestimated had grown into a woman who commanded respect in her own right. And after the meeting, my father and I had stood together on the balcony of his office, looking out over the city where our family had built their empire 3 generations ago. "Your mother would be so proud," he'd said quietly. "I know I failed her memory for many years, but I hope she'd forgive me for finally getting it right." "She already has," I'd replied, meaning every word. Mom always believed in second chances, in the possibility of redemption. She'd be happy to see us here together, working side by side. We'd stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over the skyline. The Morrison building cast a long shadow over the city, a physical reminder of the legacy we were building together. "Do you ever regret it?" my father had asked suddenly. "The way you handled Elena and Marcus? Some people might say you could have found a less destructive way to reveal the truth." I'd considered his question carefully before answering. "Do you regret learning the truth? Do you regret discovering that your wife was stealing from you? That your heir wasn't your son? That you were being manipulated and deceived for 18 years? "No," he'd said without hesitation. "Whatever pain the truth caused, it was better than living a lie." "Then I don't regret anything," I'd replied. "Elena made her choices, Dad. She chose to deceive you, to steal from our family, to raise another man's child as your heir. The consequences of those choices weren't my responsibility, they were hers." That conversation had finally put to rest any lingering doubts I'd had about my methods. Elena and Richard had been criminals who'd systematically defrauded and manipulated my family for 2 decades. Exposing their crimes hadn't made me a monster. It had made me a protector of justice. Marcus had eventually found his way to a better life, last I'd heard. He'd finished his GED, enrolled in community college, and was studying to become a paramedic. It wasn't the life of privilege he'd grown up expecting, but it was honest work that helped people. Something he'd never been able to say about his planned inheritance of Morrison Industries. He'd sent me a letter on the 2nd anniversary of the scandal, a brief note that had surprised me with its maturity and insight. "Sarah," he'd written, "I know we'll probably never be friends, and I understand why. But I wanted you to know that I'm grateful for what you did. Living a lie, even unknowingly, was poison. The truth hurt, but it also set me free to become who I'm supposed to be instead of who Elena wanted me to be. I hope you're happy, and I hope the Morrison legacy is everything you dreamed it would be. I'd kept that letter in my desk drawer, a reminder that sometimes the most painful revelations could also be the most liberating. Elena herself had been transferred to a minimum security facility after serving 3 years of her sentence, but her health had deteriorated significantly during her incarceration. Prison medical reports indicated she was suffering from early onset dementia, possibly triggered by the stress of her conviction and imprisonment. I'd felt no satisfaction in her decline. By that point, my revenge was complete, and Elena was simply paying the natural consequences of her actions. Sometimes justice looked like dramatic courtroom scenes or public humiliation, and sometimes it looked like a broken woman slowly losing her memory in a prison cell. Richard Blackwood had fared somewhat better, using his time in federal prison to write a memoir about corporate espionage and white-collar crime. The book had become a bestseller, though all proceeds were being used to pay restitution to Morrison Industries and other victims of his schemes. His pharmaceutical company had been permanently dissolved, its assets and research divided among its competitors. Morrison Industries had acquired the most valuable patents and research data, effectively eliminating our biggest rival while strengthening our own market position. The final piece of my revenge had come through legal channels rather than personal action. Elena's attempt to claim alimony and a portion of my father's assets during their divorce proceedings had failed spectacularly when her criminal conviction invalidated their prenuptial agreement. Not only had she lost any claim to Morrison family wealth, but she'd been required to forfeit assets she'd brought into the marriage to help pay her restitution debts. Every designer dress, every piece of jewelry, every luxury item she'd accumulated during her years as Mrs. James Morrison had been sold at auction to compensate her victims. The house she'd owned before her marriage had been seized by federal marshals, and her personal bank accounts had been frozen and liquidated. Elena Morrison had entered federal prison as a wealthy woman and would be released as a pauper with no assets, no prospects, and a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, I'd inherited not only my rightful place in Morrison Industries, but also recovered assets that included my mother's jewelry collection, family heirlooms that Elena had appropriated, and the trust fund that should have paid for my education. Everything that had been stolen from me had been returned with interest, and everything that had been given to Marcus had reverted to its rightful owner. Justice, I'd learned, wasn't always swift, but it could be remarkably thorough when properly applied. 5 years after the scandal that had destroyed Elena's carefully constructed life, I stood in the executive boardroom of Morrison Industries as the company's new CEO, having officially succeeded my father when he'd retired on his 60th birthday. The transition had been seamless, a testament to the years we'd spent rebuilding our relationship and working together to strengthen the company. Under my leadership, Morrison Industries had become not just a pharmaceutical manufacturer, but a diversified corporation with interests in biotechnology, medical devices, and research facilities across 3 continents. The board of directors that had once viewed me as an unwelcome distraction now hung on my every word, implementing strategies I'd developed and supporting expansion plans that had doubled the company's value in just 2 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd announced during my first official board meeting as CEO, I'm pleased to report that Morrison Industries has just been named the most innovative pharmaceutical company in North America for the 3rd consecutive year. The applause that followed had been genuine and enthusiastic, very different from the polite acknowledgement I'd received as a teenager, trying to prove myself worthy of my father's attention. After the meeting, I'd returned to my corner office, formerly my father's, now redecorated to reflect my own style, while maintaining the dignity appropriate to the Morrison legacy. The walls displayed my business degrees from Harvard, awards from industry organizations, and photographs of the various charitable foundations I'd established over the years. But the most meaningful decoration was a simple framed photograph of my mother, taken when she was about my age. She was standing in this same office, then serving as my grandfather's advisor before she'd married my father and started the family that Elena had tried so hard to destroy. "We did it, Mom," I'd whispered to her photograph, as I'd done every day since becoming CEO. "The Morrison legacy is secure, and I'm finally the woman you raised me to be." My assistant had knocked on the door, interrupting my moment of reflection. "Miss Morrison? There's someone here to see you. He says it's personal." I'd looked up, expecting to see my father or perhaps one of the board members with a private concern. Instead, Marcus Hartwell had walked into my office, looking older and more serious than the golden child I'd once known. He'd changed dramatically over the past 5 years. Gone was the expensive clothing and entitled confidence of his youth, replaced by simple jeans and a work shirt that spoke of honest labor. His face was weathered by outdoor work, and his hands showed the calluses of someone who'd learned to support himself through physical effort rather than inherited privilege. "Hello, Sarah," he'd said quietly, removing a baseball cap as he'd entered my office. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I'm probably the last person you expected." "Hello, Marcus," I'd replied, gesturing for him to take a seat across from my desk. "You're right, I wasn't expecting you. What brings you here?" He'd sat down carefully as if he'd been afraid of damaging the expensive furniture. "I graduated from paramedic school last month," he'd said. "I'm working for Portland Emergency Services now. It's good work, helping people, making a difference." "Congratulations," I'd said, and I'd meant it. "I'm glad you found something meaningful." "I wanted to thank you," he'd continued, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of what he was saying. "I know that sounds strange, given everything that happened, but these past 5 years, they've been the most honest years of my life." I'd studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but I'd seen only sincerity. "You don't need to thank me, Marcus. I didn't do what I did for your benefit." "I know," he'd said, "but the result was the same. I was living a lie, being groomed to inherit something that was never mine, being taught to be someone I was never meant to be. The truth destroyed the life I thought I wanted, but it gave me the chance to build the life I actually needed." We'd sat in silence for a moment, two people who'd been shaped by Elena's deception in very different ways, finally able to speak honestly about what had happened between our families. "I've been following Morrison Industries' success," Marcus had said eventually. "You've done incredible things with the company. Your father, James, he must be very proud." "He is," I'd replied. "We both are. This company means everything to us." Marcus had nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind my words. Morrison Industries wasn't just a business. It was a family legacy, a testament to 3 generations of hard work and innovation. Elena had tried to steal that legacy and give it to a child who had no legitimate claim to it. "I wanted you to know that I harbor no resentment," Marcus had said. "Elena taught me to feel entitled to things that weren't mine, to expect a future that was built on lies. What you did, it was justice. Painful justice, but justice nonetheless." "And what about Elena?" I'd asked. "Do you ever see her?" Marcus's expression had darkened slightly. "She was released 6 months ago. The dementia has progressed significantly. She barely remembers who I am most days. Richard's sister has been caring for her, but it's difficult." I'd felt a complex mix of emotions at that news. Elena's mental decline hadn't been part of my planned revenge, but it seemed fitting that a woman who'd built her life on lies and manipulation would eventually lose her ability to remember her own deceptions. "I don't expect forgiveness," Marcus had continued. "I know the damage can't be undone. And I know I was complicit in Elena's scheme, even if I didn't understand what was happening. But I wanted you to know that I'm grateful for the truth, even though it cost me everything I thought I wanted." "You're building something better now," I'd said, and I'd meant it. Honest work, helping people. That's more valuable than any inheritance. Marcus had smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since we were children. "It is. I'm proud of what I do now in a way I never could have been proud of inheriting Morrison Industries under false pretenses." He'd stood to leave but paused at the door. "Sarah, I hope you find happiness. You've reclaimed your legacy and proven yourself worthy of it. I hope that brings you the peace you deserve." After he'd left, I'd sat alone in my office for a long time, thinking about the conversation and what it meant for the final chapter of my revenge story. Marcus had found his own form of redemption through honest work and acceptance of the truth. Elena was paying for her crimes through imprisonment and mental decline. Richard was serving his sentence and would emerge from prison a broken man. And I had reclaimed everything that had been stolen from me, building it into something even greater than what had been lost. The circle was complete. Justice had been served. The Morrison legacy was secure. That evening, I'd driven to my mother's grave as I did every month, bringing fresh white roses and news of the company's continued success. "It's over, Mom," I'd said, kneeling beside her headstone as the sun set behind the oak trees. "Elena can't hurt our family anymore. The truth won, just like you always said it would." The wind had rustled through the leaves, and I'd felt that familiar sense of my mother's presence, as if she were finally at peace, knowing that her daughter had not only survived Elena's deception, but had emerged stronger because of it. I'd built a life worth living, a legacy worth preserving, and a future worthy of the Morrison name. My revenge was complete, but more importantly, my redemption was real. Elena had tried to destroy me to protect her stolen life, but instead, she'd given me the motivation to become everything I was meant to be. Her betrayal had been the catalyst for my transformation from overlooked daughter to powerful CEO, from victim to victor. Sometimes the greatest revenge was simply living well, and I had never lived better than I was living now. The Morrison Empire was mine by right, strengthened by struggle, and secured for future generations. Elena's 18-year deception had ultimately failed, brought down by the truth she'd tried so hard to bury. In the end, justice had indeed tasted sweeter than I'd ever imagined possible.